In the summer of 480 BC, the Grand Army of Xerxes, the Great King of Kings of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, was on the march. At the Persian fortress of Doriscus in Thrace, which had been founded by Darius the Great around 512 BC, Herodotus tells us that the invading army was divided into 3 groups. Xerxes divided the land force into 3 columns. He ordered one to march along the coast, keeping pace with the fleet. Mardonius and Masistes were in command of this division. A second division was ordered to take an inland route under the command of Tritantaecmes and Xerxes. The third, in which Xerxes himself traveled, marched between the two, and its generals were Smerdomenes and Megabyzus. Though this area had already sworn fealty to the empire, the Persians weren't taking any chances. Dividing their forces in this way was not only safer, but also kept their enemies guessing about Persian movements as they advanced towards less friendly territory. It also provided protection against potential seaborne raids and hostile Greeks targeting Persian troops on land and their numerous supply depots. At first, the fleet and the army moved closely together, but they parted ways near present-day Akanthos, on the Athos finger of Chalkidiki. Mardonius, who was accompanying Xerxes, knew the area well. 12 years earlier, strong North Aegean winds had wrecked many ships under his command as they attempted to navigate around Mount Athos. To avoid this, Herodotus says that Xerxes had previously ordered a canal to be built so that his ships could skip rounding the mountain. Remnants of the canal are still visible today, but safety wasn't the only concern. Securing food and water supplies for an army as massive as Xerxes's was equally important. While some food was transported with the army using pack animals, much of it was obtained from land. This was especially true for sources of water. Herodotus claims that the Persian army's men and animals were so numerous that they drained entire rivers and streams, a clear exaggeration, but one that underscores the immense logistical demands of such a force. With tens of thousands, or possibly over 100,000 troops according to higher estimates, it would have been far easier to supply the army if it was divided and took separate routes to find food, rather than traveling as a single mass. Although specific paths aren't detailed, Persian commanders likely chose routes close to dependable sources of water. Despite delays caused by rough terrain, the army eventually regrouped with the Persian fleet at Thermopylae, a coastal town on the Thermatic Gulf near modern-day Thessaloniki, Greece. From there, they headed towards Macedonia. Thus far, the Persians' Greek and Thracian allies had proven reliable, with more joining their ranks along the way. Xerxes made a stop in the Kingdom of Macedonia, specifically in the region of what's today Pieria. There, he received heralds from other parts of Greece. Herodotus informs us, Xerxes spent several days in Pieria whilst one of his 3 divisions cleared a route over the mountains of Macedonia for the whole army to take into the country of the Perrhaebians. It was then that the heralds who had been sent through Greece to demand earth and water returned, some empty-handed, some bearing it. The peoples who gave earth and water included the Thessalians, the Dolopes, the Enianes, the Perrhaebians, the Locrians, the Magnesians, the Melians, the Achaeans of Photiotis, the Thebans, and all of the Boeotians except for the Thespians and the Plataeans. This was likely better than Xerxes had anticipated, as nearly all of northern and much of central Greece had surrendered without a single arrow being fired. Beyond them lay the true prize, Attica and its heart, Athens, which on its own could not withstand the ever-growing Persian coalition. If Athens fell, everything west of the Isthmus of Corinth would be at risk. Argos, which had remained neutral until now, might also align with the Great King and create a barrier between Sparta and Corinth. From there, it would be much easier to handle each polis in the Peloponnese individually. Excluding the Greeks of Sicily, southern Italy, and those living on the northernmost coasts of the Black Sea, if one counted the recently allied Greek states, as well as those who had previously submitted to the Persians, like the Macedonians, and those already under Persian rule for decades, such as the Ionians, there were likely more Greek speakers aligned with Xerxes, the Great King of Persia, than against him. The Kingdom of Macedon had maintained particularly close ties with the Persian Empire since the reign of Darius the Great. Around 512 or 511 BC, Darius campaigned against Scythians to the northeast, driving them farther from Thrace and Macedonia. It was likely during this campaign that the Macedonian king, Amyntas I, witnessed the might of Persia firsthand, prompting him to submit to Darius by offering earth and water without resistance. Despite his submission, Amyntas retained considerable autonomy in northern Greece due to Macedon's distance from the Persian heartland. To further cement ties, Amyntas gave his daughter, Gygea, in marriage to the Persian noble Bubaris, son of Megabazus. In 480 BC, Darius' son Xerxes met with Amyntas' son and successor, Alexander I. The Macedonian king provided Xerxes with a supply depot on his territory and contributed infantry to the Great King's army. After a period of rest and resupply, the Persian coalition advanced southward towards Thessaly. Popular culture often perpetuates the misconception that all of the Greeks were united in a struggle for their freedom against the autocratic, tyrannical Great King of Persia, who sought to destroy their civilization and enslave them. This perspective was certainly shared by many classical writers, historians, and playwrights who portrayed the Persians as a formidable, yet alien civilization that was bent on destroying the Greek-speaking world. In reality, the Achaemenid kings did little to interfere with the day-to-day lives of the Greeks they ruled over. In general, they practiced a policy of cultural and religious tolerance that allowed subject peoples to maintain their traditions and beliefs. The Persian Empire's founder, Cyrus the Great, was remembered, even by Greek writers, as one of the most magnanimous rulers in recent memory. His benevolent yet pragmatic approach to governance fostered loyalty among many of the empire's diverse populations and set a lasting precedent for future Achaemenid rulers. There's a stela in the Louvre with a Greek copy of a letter written by Darius I to one of his satraps named Gadatas that helps to demonstrate such policy. In the letter, Darius reprimands Gadatas for his misconduct against gardeners from a sanctuary dedicated to the god Apollo. The text of the stela reads as follows. From Darius, King of Kings, to his servant Gadatas. I have learned that you are not following my orders faithfully. I commend your plan for working my land and seeding the farthest parts of Asia with fruit trees from across the Euphrates, and you will have great favor in my court for this. But since you are ignoring my orders respecting the gods, if you do not change your course, you will feel the power of my displeasure. For you are forcing the sacred gardeners of Apollo to pay tribute and dig up unhallowed ground, ignoring the customs of my ancestors toward the divine, who instructed the Persians in strict justice. Were the Achaemenid Persian kings perfect? Of course not. The Ionian, Egyptian, Babylonian, and other revolts during the reigns of Darius and Xerxes, along with the destruction inflicted on local sanctuaries, stand as clear evidence of their shortcomings. Yet, when measured against other autocratic rulers of antiquity, the Achaemenid kings were notably more tolerant and restrained in their punishments than many of their Near Eastern predecessors and contemporaries. That's not to say that Greeks were clamoring to join the Persian Empire, but neither were they eager to ally with fellow Greeks, whom they had viewed as bitter rivals for decades, if not centuries. Unlike Athens, a fledgling democracy, most regions in northern and central Greece that aligned with Persia were ruled by oligarchs, tyrants, military strongmen, or, in Macedon's case, a king. Their loyalty lay first and foremost with their own polis, or region, and not with any abstract ideal of Greek political unity, which had never truly encompassed the entire Greek-speaking world. Ultimately, they sought survival, peace, and what they believed was best for their community. If that meant paying higher taxes and supplying men and ships to the armies of a distant emperor in Western Asia, so be it. Herodotus, to an extent, seems to agree. The declared purpose of the Great King's expedition was to mount an attack on Athens, but, in fact, the whole of Greece was his objective. The Hellenes had known about this for a long time, but the knowledge did not affect them all in the same way. Those who had submitted earth and water to the Persians were confident that they would suffer no harm at the hands of the barbarians. But those who had not submitted were very afraid, since there were not enough ships in Hellas capable of taking on the invader. Indeed, most of them had no wish to get involved in the war, and were now enthusiastically Medizing. Things looked bleak for Athens. The further south the Great King advanced, the larger his army grew, and the less time the Athenians and their allies had to organize a defense. As the situation grew more dire by the day, Herodotus recounts that the Athenians dispatched several envoys to the oracle at Delphi to seek guidance on what they should do. The reported answer of the Pythia, or high priestess of the oracle, was not at all reassuring. "Why are you here, poor wretches? Fly to the ends of the earth. Leave your homes, leave your city, its high citadel and its circling walls. Neither head nor body, nor feet nor hands will stand fast. Nothing will remain, only disaster. Fire and fierce Ares driving a Syrian chariot will wreck your city and other strongholds too. Fierce flames will devour your holy temples. Even now they stream with sweat, they quake with fear. Dark blood runs from the roof tiles. They foresee calamity inescapable. Go, therefore, leave. Face your doom with courage." Naturally, the Athenian envoys were filled with dread, but were convinced to ask the Pythia a second time for more clarity. Her response was the following: "Pallas Athena cannot sway the will of Zeus with words of prayer or clever argument. But a second answer I will give you, firm as adamant. All of the land held within Cecrops' borders, and embraced by the slopes of holy Cithaeron, shall be seized by the enemy. But, Trito-born one, far-seeing Zeus grants you this. Only a wooden wall will keep you safe, a safe keep for you and your children. Do not wait for this mighty army coming overland, nor stand in the way of its horsemen or foot soldiers. Retreat, turn your backs. Yet you will meet in battle. Salamis divine, you will be the death of mothers' sons. Retreat, turn your backs. Yet you will meet in battle. Salamis divine, you will be the death of mothers' sons, at the time of Demeter's scattering or her gathering." Though the second prophecy seemed more hopeful, it was also more cryptic than the first. When the envoys reported the Pythia's words to the assembly, a fierce debate followed, especially over the meaning of the wooden wall that would keep them safe. Some argued it referred to the Acropolis, once fortified with a wooden stockade. Others believed the wall meant a wall of ships. Among the latter group was Themistocles, son of Neocles. Though born into wealth, Themistocles, whose name means famed for right, came from a relatively obscure family. His father was an Athenian, whose name, Neocles, means new fame, implying that he may have obtained his fortune rather recently. Themistocles' mother is believed to have been a Thracian. Thus, it was likely not from the old Athenian aristocracy, which makes it all the more remarkable that by 493 or 492 BC, he'd achieved the position of chief archon of Athens. This may have been due to both his charisma as well as his innovative thinking, for Themistocles was a huge proponent of making Athens a naval power and advocated for changing the city's main port from Phaleron to Piraeus. The need for a navy became even clearer after the Battle of Marathon, where Themistocles likely fought against the Persians and may have even been one of the 10 Athenian generals commanding the forces of Attica, though this remains unconfirmed. At the time, the only nearby state with a substantial fleet was Aegina, but as Athens' chief rival in the Saronic Gulf, it had sided with the Persians, or Medized, in 491 BC. Unfortunately, Themistocles' ambitious plans remained on the drawing board until 483 BC, when large deposits of silver were discovered at the mines of Larium, near Sunion at the southern tip of Attica. Rather than distributing the newfound silver equally among Athenian citizens, as many expected, Themistocles proposed using the funds to build a modern navy. This was a difficult decision for most in the assembly. Scholars estimate that each citizen would be giving up the equivalent of at least 2 weeks' wages, a significant sum for the majority. Themistocles persuaded the assembly to support his plan to create an Athenian navy that could not only rival neighboring Aegina's fleet, but also defend Athens against a renewed Persian attack. By 483 BC, news of Xerxes' preparations for a new invasion had likely reached Athens, making it even more imperative that the Larium silver be invested in the city's defense. In the spring and summer of 480 BC, the armies of Xerxes, the Great King of Persia, advanced toward Athens. Now, it was time to see whether Themistocles' strategy to defeat, or at least delay them, would succeed. Scholars estimate that at the time, the silver mines at Larium may have been enough to finance around 50 triremes. However, this alone would not have been enough to defeat the Persian fleet, nor does it align with Herodotus' claim of several hundred Athenian ships, specifically 180 at Salamis and 127 at Artemisium, both of which we'll get to shortly. Thus, additional reserves and other income sources from across Attica must have been tapped to build the fleet. It's also possible that some city-states loaned ships to Athens, allowing them to support the resistance without committing their own men to battle. "It is terrible to die among the waves," wrote the Greek poet Hesiod in Works and Days. Since at least the time of Homer's Odyssey, Greeks have told tales of the sea's perils, from storms and unpredictable currents to hostile pirates and mythical threats like sirens and deadly whirlpools, all capable of abruptly ending a voyage and the lives aboard. Even staying close to shore offered no guarantee of safety. In 492 BC, Mardonius discovered just how treacherous the sea could be. As he tried to round Mount Athos, a powerful north wind struck, scattering his fleet. According to Herodotus, at least 300 ships and 20,000 men were driven against the rocky shores of Mount Athos, where they met their end. Led by the admiral Megabatus, the Persian fleet sailed unchallenged along the coasts of Macedonia and Thessaly, while the main army marched almost parallel to it on land. The campaign had been coordinated so that the land army could be supported and protected by the Persian navy, and so that the two were never very far away from each other. Herodotus tells us that the Persian fleet consisted of 1,207 triremes drawn from Phoenicia, Egypt, Cyprus, and even Greek states in Ionia and western Anatolia. In addition to the warships, Herodotus also mentions another 3,000 support ships carrying horses, supplies, and soldiers. As with the Battle of Marathon, scholars today are skeptical of these figures, estimating instead that the Persian fleet likely consisted of between 500 to 800 triremes, with an equal number of supply ships to support the campaign. They do agree with Herodotus that the Persian fleet significantly outnumbered the Hellenic forces. It was also far more diverse in its ethnic makeup, and though precise numbers per nationality can't be confirmed, the general breakdown is plausible, with the largest contingents almost certainly coming from the ports of Phoenicia, Egypt, and Cyprus. So far, the anti-Persian Hellene coalition had failed to check the advance of Xerxes' army. Initially, they'd planned to make a stand at a gorge known as the Vale of Tempe with 10,000 men, but had been warned by Alexander I of Macedon that the Persian army was incredibly large and could easily bypass them. Thus, the defense of Tempe was abandoned, and with it, Thessaly submitted to the Great King. But there were two other strategic locations where the Hellenes could improve their chances of slowing, if not halting, the Persian advance. One was the pass of Thermopylae, situated in Phocis, just south of the Thessalian border. This narrow passage was easier to defend and allowed for a coordinated defense with the Hellene fleet at the nearby straits of Artemisium, positioned between the Magnesia Peninsula in southern Thessaly and the northern coast of Evia. These waters led to the Malian Gulf and the northern entrance of the Evian Gulf, a choke point that the Persian fleet would almost certainly have to navigate if it were to stay in contact with Xerxes' forces on land. The Athenians favored this plan because it offered a chance to potentially stop the massive Persian land forces before they reached Attica. They also argued that the Persians would need to be stopped at land and sea, which is why Thermopylae, in retrospect, was a better place to face them than the Vale of Tempe. However, the Spartans and the Peloponnesians argued that their stand should be made at the Isthmus of Corinth, effectively sacrificing Thessaly, Boeotia, and Attica. This was not an unreasonable strategy, considering that Thessaly and nearly all of Boeotia had already Medized. The Athenians ultimately prevailed in the debate, arguing that their fleet, the largest in the alliance, would be most effective at Artemisium. Having decided on the dual defense of Artemisium and Thermopylae, the Hellenes set out to await the arrival of Xerxes' grand army and its accompanying fleet. They established a base at Artemisium, a broad shoreline near a shrine dedicated to the goddess Artemis, where their triremes could be beached for protection. Then, they waited. Contact between the two fleets occurred when 10 Persian triremes were sent to scout the waters around the nearby island of Skiathos, just to the east of the coast of Magnesia. Herodotus tells us that 3 triremes from Troezen, Aegina, and Athens were caught off guard by the Persian ships and fled. The ships from Troezen and Aegina were captured with their crews, while the Athenians abandoned their ship and fled on foot back to Athens. Upon learning that the Persian fleet was nearby, Herodotus reports that the Hellenes sailed their ships toward the narrower channels near Chalkis. However, most scholars are skeptical of his account, since it would have left their ground forces, who were fortifying their positions at Thermopylae, exposed. The Persian scout ships scanned the coast of Magnesia for safe harbors as they waited for the rest of the fleet to arrive. But when the massive fleet did arrive, there wasn't enough room for all of the ships to anchor near shore. Many had to remain at sea, unfortunately, just as a violent storm descended on the area. The ships that managed to reach land were spared, but many of those left at sea couldn't hold their positions against the fierce winds and were driven aground along Magnesia's rocky coastline. For 3 days, the Persian fleet was battered by the storm. When it finally subsided, the shores of Magnesia were strewn with debris, along with gold and silver objects from the wrecked ships. Herodotus reports that 400 ships, about 1/3 of Xerxes' fleet, were destroyed in the storm. Nevertheless, the remaining 800 or so vessels still outnumbered those of the Hellenes. These ships took up positions along the southern coast of the Magnesian peninsula in an area called Aphetai, which was directly across from the Greek ships stationed at Artemisium. However, 15 Persian ships apparently lost their way and mistook the Greek ships anchored at Artemisium for part of their own fleet. As they unknowingly sailed toward the northern coast of Evia, these ships were captured by the Hellenes, and their crews were interrogated before being sent to the Isthmus of Corinth as prisoners. Despite this small success for the Hellenes, the Persians still held a significant numerical advantage, and, due to this, the Spartan commander-in-chief of the Greek naval forces, Eurybiades, considered withdrawing the fleet to regroup at the Isthmus of Corinth. In his usual colorful style, Herodotus describes the scene as follows. When the Hellenes arrived back at Artemisium and saw so many ships harbored at Aphetai and the fleet filling the whole expanse of the water, they were alarmed because the barbarians were in much better shape than they had expected, and they decided to withdraw down the Greek coast. When they found out about this, the Evians tried to persuade Eurybiades to delay for a short time to enable them to evacuate their children and households. They were unsuccessful in this, but then approached Themistocles, the Athenian commander, offering to pay him 300 talents if he could make the Hellenes stay where they were and give battle off Evia. Themistocles managed this by passing on 5 talents out of the cash he received to Eurybiades, as if it was a gift from his personal funds. Then, with Eurybiades persuaded, Adeimantus, the Corinthian commander, still resisting, declared that he was going to sail away from Artemisium straight away. So, Themistocles gave him this pledge. You are not going to desert us, because I will personally reward you more generously than the king of the Medes would if you deserted the alliance. This said, he delivered 3 talents of silver to Adeimantus' ship. Everyone was brought round by his bribery, the Evians were well pleased, and Themistocles made an excellent profit. Nobody knew he kept the rest of the money, and those who had a share of it were convinced that it had been provided by Athens for the purpose. Whether or not the story of Themistocles bribing other members of the coalition is true can't be determined, but Herodotus' account highlights the very real fragility of the Hellene alliance. Eurybiades was appointed supreme commander, if only in title, as a compromise due to the other allies' mistrust of Athenian leadership. While listing the number of allied ships at Artemisium, Herodotus also explains the reason as to why a Spartan was given command of the fleet in the following passage of Histories. Athenians contributed 127 triremes, the Corinthians contributed 40, and the Megarians 20. The Chalcidians manned 20 ships supplied by Athens. There were 18 triremes from Aegina, 12 from Sicyon, and 10 from Lacedaemon. Then 8 from Epidaurus, 7 from Eretria. The total assembled at Artemisium was 271. The commander-in-chief was the Spartan, Eurybiades. This was because the allies had declared that, if a Spartan was not in command, they would refuse to accept Athenian leadership and abandon the operation that was being planned. From the start, even before the attempt to bring Sicily into the alliance, there had been talk of entrusting the Athenians with command of the fleet, but when the allies opposed this, The Athenians, in their great concern for the survival of Hellas, conceded, recognizing that conflict over leadership would bring about its destruction. Since Athens contributed the largest number of ships, and Eurybiades lacked expertise in naval warfare, he likely deferred to Themistocles, who by then was already an experienced commander at sea. As the Hellene and Persian fleets were making their way toward the Straits of Artemisium, not far across the water to the west, a few thousand soldiers, led by Leonidas, one of Sparta's 2 kings, was preparing for what would be one of the most important military encounters in world history. Thermopylae. Herodotus gives us some history about the place and tells us just why the Hellenes chose to make a stand there. This place is generally known as Thermopylae, Hot Gates, though the people who live in it or nearby just call it Pylae, Gates. The pass from Trachinian territory onward into Greece narrows to about half a plethoron, but it is even narrower at other points, and at Alpeni and by the river Phoenix near the city of Anthela, it is only wide enough for a single wagon. To the west of Thermopylae, the mountainside rears up, impassable, sheer, and lofty, towards the heights of the Otanian range. To the east of the road lie mudflats and the sea. There are hot bathing pools in the pass, known as chutroi, cooking pots, by the locals, and close to them, an altar dedicated to Heracles. A long time ago, the Phocians had built a wall with gates in it across the pass. They did this for fear of the Thessalians who were in the process of migrating from Thesprotia in order to settle in Aeolus, land which now belongs to them. The Thessalians threatened to overrun the Phocians, and they protected themselves in various ways to prevent the Thessalians invading their land, including diverting the hot springs into the pass to carve gullies in the ground. This ancient wall was mostly in ruins when the Hellenes now decided to rebuild it to block the barbarians' entry into Greece. Also, the village called Alpeni is close to the road here, and this was to be their supply depot. These places seem ideal to the Hellenes. They had explored the area and concluded that the barbarians would not be able to exploit their weight of numbers, or their cavalry, in the pass. So this is where they resolved to make their stand against the invaders of Greece. Over the past 2.5 millennia, rivers and streams have deposited silt into the Malian Gulf, pushing the shoreline back several kilometers and raising the ground level at the base of the surrounding mountains. Despite these changes, much of the landscape remains the same. The hot spring that gave Thermopylae its name still flows, and Mount Kallidromon continues to dominate the skyline. Traces of what is believed to have been the Phocian Wall have also been discovered. The combination of natural and man-made features made Thermopylae highly defensible against a direct assault. However, the area was not without vulnerabilities. Alternative routes into central Greece did exist. While the Persian army could have taken other paths into Boeotia and onward to Attica, their commanders likely chose to pass through Thermopylae to avoid being separated from Xerxes' fleet. After marching through Greece during the spring and summer without encountering so much as a hostile arrow, they probably expected little, if any, resistance in the area. If this was indeed their reasoning, they were in for a surprise. Herodotus tells us what was waiting for the Persian army at Thermopylae. The Hellene force awaiting the Persians was made up of 300 Spartan hoplites, 1,000 Tegeans and Mantineans, 500 of each, 100 from Orchomenos, with 1,000 from the rest of Arcadia, 400 from Corinth, 200 from Philios, and 80 from Mycenae. That was the Peloponnesian contingent. Then, from Boeotia, there were 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans. In addition, The Opuntian Locrians' entire army and 1,000 Phocians had answered the call. The Hellenes had approached them directly. They had assured them that they had nothing to fear, telling them that the force posted to Thermopylae was an advance guard, and the rest of the allies were expected to join it any day, and that they were protected at sea by the Athenians, Aeginetans, and other naval contingents assigned to this task. A further assurance they gave was that it was a man advancing into Greece, not a god, and that there was not, nor ever could there be any mortal man who did not meet with disaster at some point in his life, and, finally, that it was the greatest men who suffered the greatest disasters. Therefore, being mortal, the man bearing down on them was bound to fall short of achieving his goal. The Opuntian Locrians and Phocians took all this in and marched to Trachis to assist in the defense. While it was just over half of the 10,000 men originally planned for the defense at the Vale of Tempe, the force at Thermopylae included soldiers from some of the most battle-hardened regions of Greece. Interestingly, Herodotus mentions that Thebes had already submitted earth and water to Xerxes, yet here at Thermopylae were 400 Thebans ready to fight alongside the Hellenes. Like most Greek city-states of the time, Thebes had both pro- and anti-Persian factions. The 400 here belonged to the latter. Located deep in Boeotia, Thebes was some distance from Macedonia and Thessaly, and its leaders may have been playing a game of wait and see, telling Xerxes' heralds what they wanted to hear without publicly declaring their allegiance. If the Persians stalled in northern Greece, or lost the war entirely, the Thebans could preserve the claim of neutrality should the anti-Persian coalition choose to punish those who had Medized. Herodotus also tells us that each contingent was led by its own commander, with the Spartan leader being the most famous of all. In histories, he tells us, each of these contingents was under the command of a general from their own city, but the leader of the whole army was the most admired of all, Leonidas, the Lacedaemonian, son of Anaxandridas and descended from Heracles. He came to Thermopylae with the customary 300 picked men, but these were selected from those with living sons. The Spartans had dispatched Leonidas and his men so that the rest of their allies would see them and take up arms rather than Medize, which indeed they might have done if they heard that the Spartans were hanging back. The rest of the Spartans were detained by the Feast of Carneia, but as soon as they had celebrated it, they intended to mobilize their full strength and, leaving a small garrison in Sparta, to march to join them with all speed. The rest of the allies had similar intentions. In their case, it was the Olympic festival that fell at the same time as these events, and they were not expecting matters to come to a head so quickly at Thermopylae, so they too sent advance contingents only. The 300 Spartans, including King Leonidas, would have been Spartiates, full citizens of Sparta who held the highest status within the Lacedaemonian social hierarchy. According to Herodotus, these men were chosen from those with living sons, suggesting they were over 30 years old, as Spartans were not permitted to live with their wives or maintain a household until they reached that age and had completed their full military training. Spartiate status could only be passed through an unbroken male line, and in this way, Leonidas acknowledged the mission's risk by selecting men who could fight to the death without endangering Sparta's future military strength. Interestingly, within 2 centuries, and likely already in Herodotus' time, the Spartiate population had begun to decline sharply due to war casualties, natural disasters, and a consistently low birth rate. Leonidas was the son of King Anaxandridas II of Sparta, of the Aegeid royal line. Initially, Anaxandridas' first wife was unable to bear him a son, so he took a second wife, who gave birth to Cleomenes I, his eldest son and eventual successor. However, After Cleomenes' birth, Anaxandridas returned to his first wife, who then bore him 3 sons, Dorieus, Leonidas, and Cleombrotus. Leonidas was thus the half-brother of Cleomenes. When Cleomenes died after much controversy, he was succeeded by Leonidas, who then married Cleomenes' daughter, Gorgo. Becoming one of Sparta's 2 kings in 489 BC, Leonidas was about 60 years old when he left for Thermopylae. Writing in the 1st century BC, the historian Diodorus Siculus also praises Leonidas' courage while giving different numbers for the Hellenes at Thermopylae. In his most famous work, Library of History, he writes, "The leader of the entire expedition was Eurybiades, the Lacedaemonian, and in command of the troops sent to Thermopylae was Leonidas, the Spartan king, a man who attached great importance to his courage and generalship. When Leonidas was given this assignment, he announced that only 1,000 men would be accompanying him on the campaign. The ephors declared that he was leading far too few against such a mighty force and instructed him to take more. He told them in confidence that they were few if their mission was to stop the barbarians getting through the passes, but actually many in terms of the mission they were setting out on. Baffled by this riddling response, the ephors asked him if he thought he was taking them to perform some task that was of little worth. His answer was that he was, in all appearance, leading them out to hold the passes, but the truth of it was that they were going to die for the freedom of all. So, if these 1,000 men marched, Sparta would win greater renown when they died. But if the Lacedaemonians marched out in full force, Lacedaemon would be wiped out, because not one of them would consider taking flight to save his life. There were, then, 1,000 Lacedaemonians, including 300 Spartans, and 3,000 other Hellenes were sent with them to Thermopylae. The remaining 700 Lacedaemonian warriors were likely perioikoi, mostly non-citizen inhabitants of Laconian cities outside of Sparta. The 300 Spartans mentioned by both Herodotus and Diodorus would have been the most elite among the hoplites. They were full Spartan citizens, or Spartians. Each hoplite, particularly among the 300 Spartans, would have had an attendant, typically a helot, who was essentially a state-owned serf. Non-Spartan warriors may have had a lower-class citizen or slave as their attendant. Though they're not mentioned by Herodotus or Diodorus, these attendants would have served as baggage carriers and laborers for tasks like refurbishing the old Phocian wall. They could also act as light combat troops if needed. However, they would have likely lacked the formal training of hoplites and been easy targets for seasoned enemy soldiers. By 480 BC, the Persians had maintained relatively friendly relations with the peoples of northern Greece, specifically the Thracians, Macedonians, and many of the peoples of Thessaly for well over a decade. But the farther south Xerxes' army marched, the more unfamiliar and dangerous the terrain became, and the people potentially more hostile. For this reason, the Persians employed numerous Greek guides to advise them as they advanced. One of these was, perhaps surprisingly, the former Spartan king from the Eurypontid line, Demaratus. Recall that in the spring of 506 BC, one of Sparta's 2 kings, Cleomenes, had assembled a large Spartan and Peloponnesian force against the increasingly democratic Athens of Cleisthenes, with the aim of installing a pro-Spartan faction in its government. However, as Herodotus tells us, events took an unexpected turn. But as they were about to engage their forces in battle, the Corinthians, after considering among themselves and concluding that they were becoming involved in unjust acts, were the first to do an about-face and leave. And next to leave was Demaratus, son of Ariston, the other king of the Spartans, who had joined Cleomenes in leading the army out of Lacedaemon and had not disagreed with him before. The final straw, however, was a dispute over how to handle Aegena's alliance with Persia. In 491 BC, as Persia demanded tokens of submission, earth and water, from the Greek city-states, Aegina complied. This decision to Medize was seen by Sparta as a direct betrayal of Greek independence. However, Aegena's reasons had more to do with protecting itself against its rival, Athens, than with any hostility toward Sparta. Regardless, Cleomenes took a hard stance against Aegena's Medizing and wanted to punish the island in order to make an example of it and prevent other states from even considering submitting to Persia. However, Demaratus opposed Cleomenes' intervention, possibly out of differing views on how to handle foreign relations, or as part of their ongoing rivalry. This opposition angered Cleomenes, who felt that Demaratus was obstructing his authority and weakening Sparta's stance against Persia. Cleomenes then used the dispute with Aegina to escalate his attack on Demaratus, ultimately leading him to challenge Demaratus' legitimacy as king. By securing a false declaration from the Oracle of Delphi that Demaratus was illegitimate, Cleomenes not only removed his rival, but also strengthened Sparta's position to act decisively against Aegina without internal opposition. Following his unjust removal from power around 491 BC, Demaratus went into exile and ultimately sought refuge in the Persian Empire, where he was welcomed by King Darius I. When Xerxes succeeded Darius, Demaratus became a trusted member of his court. A wise and honorable man, Demaratus now served as an advisor to Xerxes in Greece. By August of 480 BC, Xerxes and his generals were aware that a group of Hellenes was fortifying their position at Thermopylae. Herodotus tells us the following. Xerxes sent a mounted scout to see how many Hellenes there were and to observe what they were doing. While still in Thessaly, he had heard that this small force was being assembled and that it was to be led by the Lacedaemonians and Leonidas of the house of Heracles. When the scout rode up towards the enemy position, he was able to take a good look at it. However, he could not see the whole of the defending force because part of it was out of sight to the rear of the wall that had been rebuilt. But he could see the men who were in front of it with their weapons laid out on the ground, and it happened to be the Spartans who were posted there at that moment. The scout was amazed to see that some of them were exercising, while others were simply combing their hair. He counted them and closely observed all that he could. Then he rode back unchallenged, for there was no pursuit, and in fact, nobody took any notice of him at all. So, he returned to Xerxes and reported everything he had seen. Xerxes listened to this, but could not comprehend its meaning, which was that these men were making themselves ready to be killed, and to kill to the best of their ability. Their behavior seemed laughable to him, and he sent for Demaratus, who was in the camp, and questioned him to find out why they were doing this. Demaratus replied, "I told you about these men before, when we were setting off for Greece, but you just laughed while I told you how I saw this business turning out. Yet it is very important to me that I set out the facts before you, O king. So listen to me now. These men are here to fight with us for the pass, and that is what they are preparing to do. It is their custom to dress their hair when they are about to risk their lives. You must understand that if you can overcome these men and those that have stayed behind in Sparta, no other race of mankind remaining will be able to lift a hand against you. For now, O king, you are taking on the fairest city-state, the fairest kingdom, and the finest men in all of Hellas." Xerxes found it quite impossible to believe what he was hearing, and asked a second time how such a small force could face his army in battle. Demaratus answered, "Punish me as a liar, O king, if things do not turn out as I say they will." But nothing he could say would convince Xerxes, so the great king waited for 4 days, confident that the Hellenes would sneak away. Diodorus Siculus recounts a similar story in Library of History. The great king asked the Laconian, "Will the Greeks fly more swiftly than my horses can gallop, or do they have the spirit to stand and fight this mighty force?" Demaratus, they say, replied, "You have personal knowledge of Hellene bravery, for you use Hellene troops to suppress barbarians who rise against you. So, do not think that men who fight better than Persians to make your rule secure will place themselves in harm's way any less bravely when fighting against Persians for their own freedom." With a scornful laugh, Xerxes commanded Demaratus to stay at his side and see the Lacedaemonians put to flight. What exactly was going through the mind of the great king as he heard such warnings isn't known, but he obviously didn't heed them. After all, a few thousand Greek hoplites, no matter how well they were trained, would be no match for the thousands of men he had brought with him from all parts of the known world. A small band of Hellenes wasn't going to stop his army from marching south. He would annihilate them in their makeshift fortress if they got in his way. Still, Xerxes probably sent a herald to Thermopylae to give the Greeks there one last chance to lay down their weapons and surrender. According to Plutarch, Xerxes issued a command to Leonidas, demanding that he and his men lay down their arms. Leonidas' laconic reply was simply, "Molon lave," come and take them. After 4 days, Xerxes grew impatient and ordered his men to attack. According to Herodotus, the first wave consisted of Medes, Persians, and Scythians, the latter being men from the area around Susa. He describes the scene as follows. After 4 days, when the Hellenes had still not budged, Xerxes, now angered by the lack of respect he felt they were foolishly displaying, sent in the Medes and the Scythians, commanding them to take the Hellenes alive and bring them into his presence. They swept down on the Hellene ranks. Many fell, but others took their place and would not be driven back despite the great violence of the resistance. However, it was plain for all to see, and especially for the king, that in this great mass there were few real men. The fighting went on all day, and eventually the Medes were withdrawn, very badly mauled, and the Persians took over the assault. These were the men the king called his immortals, and Hydarnes was their commander, and they were expected to win the battle without difficulty. But when they engaged with the Hellenes, they did no better than the Median contingent. This was because they were fighting in the pass on a narrow front, and with shorter spears than the Hellenes, and they could not exploit their superior numbers. The Lacedaemonians fought most remarkably, demonstrating their combat skill in the face of men who lacked it. For example, they would all turn their backs and pretend to give way, and the barbarians, seeing this, chased, shouting and clattering after them. When they had almost caught up with them, the Lacedaemonians wheeled round to face them again and killed barbarians beyond counting, and there were just a few Spartan casualties. So finally, the Persians fell back. They had made no progress into the pass, although they had tried attacking in waves and in every other way. The king watched the battle from a throne, and it is said that during these assaults he leapt up 3 times in his deep concern for his troops. In Library of History, Diodorus Siculus gives a similar account, though with a few differing details. Xerxes gathered his army together and launched his attack on the Hellenes at Thermopylae. He positioned the Medes out in front of all the other peoples, either selecting them for their courage or because he wished to be rid of them all, for their spirit was still unbowed, having only recently lost the hegemony which their ancestors had enjoyed. And he picked out the brothers and sons of men who had fallen at Marathon to stand by the Medes in the belief that they would take their revenge upon the Hellenes with the greatest fury. So the Medes, drawn up as I have described, attacked the defenders of Thermopylae, but Leonidas was ready for them with his Hellenes massed in the narrowest part of the pass. The fighting was ferocious, with the king present to observe how bravely the barbarians fought, and the Hellenes focused on their liberty, with Leonidas urging them into the fray. An astounding struggle developed. They were fighting hand to hand at close quarters, and the lines were densely packed together, so for a long time, the battle was evenly balanced. But the Hellenes' valor was superior, and their shields were larger, and the Medes gradually gave way, for many of them fell, and not a few were wounded. Their place in the line was taken by the Scythians and Saka, chosen for their bravery. These were fresh troops taking on men who were already exhausted, but they could not stand the heat of battle for long. They were cut down and forced back by Leonidas' men, and they too gave way. The barbarians were equipped with small round shields, or peltae, which gave them the advantage on open ground where there was space for movement. But in this tight space, they could not easily wound their opponents, formed up as they were in close order with large shields protecting their entire bodies, whereas the lightness of the barbarians' protective gear was a disadvantage, and they received numerous wounds. At last, observing that the entire area of the pass was heaped with corpses, and that the barbarians could not withstand the valor of the Greeks, Xerxes sent in the picked band of Persians known as the Immortals, who were renowned as the bravest in his entire host. But when these too were put to flight, after resisting only briefly, then finally, as night fell, the battle ended. Many barbarians had been slain, but only a few Hellenes had fallen. Though scholars do agree that the battles of Thermopylae and Artemisium occurred relatively close in time, many, if not most, are skeptical that they took place over the same 3 consecutive days, as Herodotus claims. After a day of waiting and considerable debate, the Hellenes decided to sail out and directly confront the Persian ships. While the maneuver took the Persians by surprise, the attack must have seemed like madness. Given the vast number of ships they possessed, the Persians expected the Greek fleet to remain on the defensive, not to launch an offensive. But with much of the Persian fleet spread out and anchored around Aphetai, the Hellenes were able to target isolated units and capture 30 ships, including some with important commanders. Licking their wounds, the Persians fared little better the next day, as several of their ships were caught in a storm and destroyed while attempting to sail around Evia. Herodotus describes what occurred as follows. Although it was high summer, there was torrential rain all through the night, with thunderclaps rolling off Mount Pelion, and the wreckage and corpses driven into Aphetai became draped around the prows of the ships and entangled with the oar blades. With such terrible things happening to them, the barbarians were convinced they were doomed. For as soon as they had recovered from shipwreck in the tempest raging off Pelion, they found themselves caught up in a sharp sea battle. And after that, they were hit by another terrible storm with flash floods streaming down to the sea and great claps of thunder. This happened to the fleet at Aphetai at night, but the ships detached to sail around Evia suffered much more terribly. They were caught out in the open sea, and their fate was dire. The tempest struck them while they were off a stretch of coast called the Hollows, and they were carried blindly before the wind and and dashed against the rocky shore. So, divine intervention brought it about that Hellene and Persian numbers would be more evenly matched. The force off the hollows of Avia was wiped out. The barbarians at Aphetai were very glad to see the dawn. They made no move the next day, content to rest up after the suffering they had been through. However, the Hellenes were reinforced by the arrival of 53 more Athenian ships, and this, and the report they now received that the barbarian fleet sailing around Evia had been completely destroyed, gave them great encouragement. So, after staying on the defensive, they sailed out at about the same time as the day before, and attacked some Caecilian ships. They sank them, and sailed back to Artemisium as night fell. The second day at Thermopylae was much like the first, with Xerxes' forces once again repelled at the Phocian wall. The fighting was likely less intense, possibly because the Persians were waiting out the storm affecting their fleet off the coast of nearby Evia. They may also have been delaying their assault in the hope that their fleet would break through the Hellene line and advance in step with the army. However, most scholars believe the Persians paused their attack after learning of a route around the Greeks' strong defensive position. A local Greek named Ephialtes revealed a hidden mountain path, known as the Anopeia, to Xerxes, allowing the Persians to bypass the Phocian wall at Thermopylae. The path ran inland from near the Persian camp, cut through Mount Killidromon, and descended back to the coast, behind the Greek position. Herodotus explains. So, the Persians fell back yet again, having achieved no more than on the previous day. The king was struggling to think what action he could take to deal with this situation when Ephialtes, son of Eurydamos, a Malian, came to speak with him. Hoping to be richly rewarded by the king, he told him about the track that led over the mountain to Thermopylae and thus brought about the death of the Hellenes who made their stand there. Ephialtes is the man who showed the barbarians how to get over the mountain on that track, and here I record his guilt. Xerxes approved Ephialtes' proposal and, in much better spirits, gave his orders to Hydarnes and the unit he commanded, and they started off from the camp at lamplighting time. The track was first used by the Malians who lived in the area when they guided the Thessalians into Phocis after the Phocians had built their wall to block the pass and protect themselves from attack. For all that time, the Malians had known about the evil use the track could be put to. Hydarnes, commander of the famed 10,000 Immortals, set out under cover of darkness along the secret path, with his men and Ephialtes as their guide. They moved silently toward the ridge where Leonidas had stationed roughly 1,000 Phocians. At dawn, the Persians made their move. Once again, Herodotus is our main source for the attack. Dawn was breaking as the barbarians reached the crest of the ridge. Here, 1,000 Phocian hoplites were in a defensive position, as I have already explained, protecting their own territory and keeping watch over the track. The lower pass was defended, as I have described. The Phocians had willingly agreed with Leonidas that they would take on the task of defending the track over the mountain. This is how the Phocians discovered that the Persians had made the climb. At first, they were unaware of their approach because the mountainside is covered with oak trees. But there was no wind, and then they heard the rustling of many feet in the carpet of dry leaves. So, the Phocians ran to their positions and began to arm themselves, and in a moment the barbarians were there in front of them. They were surprised to see men arming, for they were not expecting any opposition, but had come up against an army. Hydarnes was concerned that the Phocians might be Spartans, and asked Ephialtes where these men were from. Much reassured that they were from Phocis, he drew his Persians up in battle formation. Under a hail of arrows, the Phocians hastily retreated to the top of the ridge, ready to die, thinking that the Persians' primary objective was to attack them. So they thought, but the Persians with Hydarnes and Ephialtes paid no further attention to them and set off down the mountain, moving fast. In short, the Phocians were taken completely by surprise. We don't know how many immortals Hydarnes had with him, but if it was even a third of the reported 10,000, the Phocians would have been hopelessly outnumbered. The Persians now had not only a path around the Phocian wall and fortress, but also the advantage of higher ground, ideal terrain for their archers and javelin throwers. The Phocians had withdrawn further uphill, only to realize they were not the target. Hydarnes continued along the Anopeia, leading his men toward Leonidas and his force at the narrow pass. Faced with overwhelming Persian numbers and the threat of encirclement, Leonidas understood that the Hellenes could not win. As it would have been pointless for all of the Greek forces at Thermopylae to die, however glorious and honorable that death might be, he chose to send the majority of them home. He knew that Thermopylae would eventually fall to Xerxes. The only question now was how long it would hold, and how many of the enemy could be taken down with it. In Herodotus' words, it is said that Leonidas personally dismissed the contingents that went home out of concern for their survival, but that he thought it would be unseemly if he and the Spartans with him abandoned the position which they had set out to defend in the first place. There is another view, which I hold firmly myself, that Leonidas ordered the others to withdraw because he had observed their lack of enthusiasm and unwillingness to play their part in facing up to the danger. As far as he was concerned, retreat would be dishonorable, but by staying behind, he won great glory, and also secured the good fortune of Sparta. For the Spartans had consulted the Delphic oracle about the war when it first began, and the Pythia had prophesied either that Lacedaemon would be laid waste or that one of its kings would fall. So, the allies who had been dismissed went off, obedient to Leonidas, and the Theban and Thespian contingents were the only ones that stayed behind with the Lacedaemonians. The Thebans reluctantly and against their will because, in truth, Leonidas kept them there as hostages. But the Thespians were fully committed. They had refused to leave Leonidas and abandon his men, and so stayed with them and shared their death. Thus, according to Herodotus and Greek tradition, Leonidas and the remnants of his 300 Spartans, along with the Thespians and Thebans, held off the great king's army long enough for the other Hellenes to escape. One of Sparta's most sacred laws forbade its soldiers from yielding their ground to the enemy. At Thermopylae, Leonidas and his Spartans would uphold this law to the very end. Herodotus describes those final hours in stark detail. So, the barbarians under Xerxes launched their attack, and the Hellenes under Leonidas, knowing that their mission was to end in death, now advanced into the wider section of the pass, much further forward than they had been before. On the 2 previous days, they had defended the line of the wall, moving forward to fight only in the narrower space, but now they engaged the barbarians outside this defile. A great number of the enemy fell. Many of them fell into the sea and drowned. Even more were trampled to death by their comrades. The slaughter was indescribable. The Hellenes fought with all their strength and with reckless fury, knowing very well that death was closing in on them, brought by the force that had come over the mountain. By this stage in the battle, most of their spears were broken, and they were killing the Persians with their swords. And, in the thick of this, Leonidas fell, his excellence proved, and with him fell many other famous Spartans. I found out the names of all the men of distinction. In fact, I know the names of the whole 300. At the same time, many famous Persians died. Among them were 2 sons of Darius, Abrocomes and Hyperanthes, half-brothers of Xerxes, who fought and fell. There was a mighty struggle between the Persians and the Lacedaemonians over Leonidas's body, and the Hellenes finally dragged it away after 4 times heroically driving the enemy back. That was the situation until the Persians and Ephialtes came up, and, as soon as they knew that they had arrived, the Hellenes changed their tactics. They fell back on a narrower section of the pass, retreated behind the wall, and took up position on the mound, where the stone lion commemorating Leonidas now stands. They formed up tightly there, except for the Thebans, and in this place they fought on with their swords, those who still had them, and with their hands and with their teeth. The barbarians, after demolishing the wall, showered them with arrows and javelins and pinned them down from the front, whilst the flanking force encircled the rest of the position. The stone lion memorial mentioned seems to have been lost to time, as no trace of it has ever been found. However, it may have looked similar to later memorials at Chaeronea and Amphipolis. Diodorus Siculus has a different version of the battle's end. Leonidas, the king of the Lacedaemonians, in his desire to crown himself and the Spartans with the greatest glory, gave orders to the rest of the Hellenes to depart and save themselves to fight alongside fellow Hellenes in the battles that were still to come. But the Lacedaemonians, he declared, must stay behind and not abandon the defense of the pass, for it was most fitting that the leaders of Hellas should be ready to die as they strove to win the highest honor. So, all the rest immediately took themselves off, and Leonidas and his comrades stayed behind to do heroic and incredible deeds. Although the Lacedaemonians were few, and he kept only the Thespians with him, and had no more than 500 men altogether, he was ready to embrace death for Hellas. After this, the Persians, having negotiated the difficult terrain with their Thracian guide, soon had Leonidas trapped between the 2 forces. The Hellenes gave no thought of their own safety, and chose glory in its place. With one voice, they urged their commander to lead them out against the enemy, before the Persians heard that their men had worked their way round to the rear. Leonidas was pleased with the spirit his men were showing, and ordered them to eat up their breakfast, as they would be eating next in Hades. He ate breakfast himself in obedience to his command, to keep his own strength up for as long as possible to endure the stresses of battle. When they were all ready after this quick meal, he ordered his soldiers to attack the Persian camp and make directly for the great king's own tent, killing anyone in their path. Obedient to his command, they formed up in close order and launched a night attack on the Persian camp, and Leonidas led the assault. The barbarians were taken by surprise and unaware of the attack's objective, and so they rushed out of their tents and gathered together noisily and in great disorder. They thought that the troops who had set out with the Thracian had been wiped out, and that the entire Hellene force was in their midst, and they were terrified. So, many of them were killed by Leonidas and his men, and even more died at the hands of their comrades, who mistakenly took them for enemies. The darkness of night made it impossible to work out what was really happening, and the confusion that spread through the whole camp resulted in greater slaughter, as one would expect. The barbarians kept killing each other because the conditions made identification impossible, because no general was giving any orders, and because there was no password to be exchanged, and, generally, nobody was thinking rationally. In fact, if the king had stayed in the royal tent, he could have easily been killed by the Hellenes, and the whole war would have been brought to a swift end. As it turned out, Xerxes had burst out of his tent into the midst of the tumult, and the Hellenes fought their way into it and butchered almost everyone they caught there. Then, all night long they roamed throughout the camp, looking for Xerxes, and this was the right thing to do. But with the dawn, the situation became fully clear. Then, the Persians saw how few the Hellenes were, and became less concerned. However, they would not tackle them face to face, but, fearful of their valor, took up positions around their flanks and rear and shot arrows and hurled javelins from every direction, and killed every one of them. And that is how the soldiers with Leonidas, who held the pass of Thermopylae, met their end. Who could not marvel at the valor they displayed? Without exception, they refused to abandon the post assigned to them by Hellas, but gladly gave their lives to save all Hellenes. They preferred to die gloriously rather than to live on in shame. Plutarch, who was certainly no fan of Herodotus, and even wrote an essay titled On the Malice of Herodotus, echoes Diodorus's description of a direct attack on the Persian camp, though is much more concise. He wrote, Herodotus, in his account of this battle, has blacked out Leonidas's greatest deed when he says that all fell in the narrow ground near the mound. It did not happen that way. For when they found out in the night about the barbarians' flank march, the Hellenes formed up, headed directly for the enemy camp, and came very close to the king's tent. They had resolved to kill him and die around him. So, they came close to his tent, killing or driving off anyone in their way. But they could not find Xerxes there, so went raging through the vast camp in search of him until, completely surrounded, they were, with some difficulty, cut down by the barbarians. Few scholars, however, accept the version told by Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch, especially since it's absent from Herodotus's histories, written only a few decades after Thermopylae, and otherwise rich in detail about the battle. Even if such a raid on the Persian camp did occur, it was unsuccessful and had no effect on the final outcome. How Herodotus, Diodorus, and even Plutarch obtained such detailed accounts of the 3 days at Thermopylae remains unknown, unless there were survivors who later recalled the events and dialogue. One theory is that the surviving Thebans, who ultimately surrendered to Xerxes, may have lived to tell these tales. Herodotus tells us, As for the Thebans under Leonidas's command, they had fought for a while for the Hellenes against the king's army because they were forced to. But when they saw that the Persians were getting the upper hand, at the moment when the Hellenes with Leonidas were rapidly falling back towards the mound, they peeled off towards the barbarian lines. They stretched out their hands in supplication and declared, and they were indeed telling the truth, that they had Medized and that Thebes had been amongst the first of the Hellenes to give the king earth and water, and that they had been forced to come to Thermopylae and could not be blamed for any of the losses suffered by the king. They saved themselves in this way, for they also had the Thessalians to vouch for them. But this was not the best of outcomes, because the barbarians killed some of them as they were approaching and made the rest prisoners. They branded most of them with the royal mark, beginning with their commander, Leontiades. This man's son, Eurymachus, was executed by the Plataeans sometime later after he had occupied their city in command of a force of 400 Thebans. Diodorus Siculus took a more nuanced view of the Thebans when he wrote, There were some 400 Thebans from the opposition party, for the people of Thebes were divided against each other over the question of forming an alliance with the Persians. With the fall of Thermopylae, central and southern Greece lay open to the advancing Persian army. To be continued in Part 5. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to Faria Faraji for bringing life to this project with his amazing original music inspired by different traditions from all over the globe. Definitely check out his channel. There's a link to it in the video description. I'd also like to thank the channel's patrons for making videos like this possible. These include, but are certainly not limited to, GrandKick69, Yap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Daniel Allen, Danny Van Eck, WanXTV, Robert Morgan, Strobex, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Hurtado Correa, Michael Trudell, Leader Titan, Micah G, John Scarberry, Andrew Bomer, Connor Dolson, Krish, David R, Stephen Ball, Gabe, Monty Grimes, Franz Robbins, Cyrus Mir, Dianastra, Nimrod Nir, Hypno Sen, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Daruwala, Anahita Debu, Gulistan Debu, Sher Kam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, X, formerly known as Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.